There was this really interesting quote from you that you basically said, without Islam, there would be no Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's very like hard hitting. So I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on the statement that you said and the importance of Islam in Shakespeare's work.
So the point I was trying to make, I think, by starting that piece with that statement, partly to get people to take attention to notice, was that Shakespeare's fame in his own period really emerges out of a genre, the Turk play, that is kind of fading at the point he starts to intervene in it, I suppose. So the mid 1590s, mid late 1590s, there'd been this fashion for putting Turkish figures on the stage. So the Grand Turk, the Ottoman Sultan, who famously would strut and shout on the stage. There was a particular kind of costume associated with that figure, large ornamental turbans. Everything was kind of exaggerated. And this all came out of primarily the huge success of Marlowe's Tamburlaine plays that had been at the very end of the 1580s. And Marlowe, with those plays, had kind of initiated this fashion for drama that ranged widely over Asian geographies, that featured prominent Muslim characters, and that were preoccupied with war, conquest, kind of particularly kind of hyper male spheres. Shakespeare's attitude to Islam is unusual when compared to the drama of his contemporaries. When Shakespeare's plays start to get sort of taken notice of in the mid 1590s, he is poking fun at that genre in interesting ways. And then something different happens, I think, when you come to Othello, which is the only play of Shakespeare's that you could really think of as a kind of, that would kind of fit into that genre as a kind of Turk play. But it again picks apart all of the constituent parts of that genre, that fashion, and turns it upside down again to kind of announce himself as a dramatist interested in doing new things with material that otherwise would be quite familiar. I mean, the most obvious example of that, I think, is that Othello begins with an audience expecting a great battle, a siege, that Cyprus will kind of be a central point for Othello tackling the Ottoman fleet, or there'll be some sort of battle. But that never happens. It leads up to it, and then it all sort of evaporates. And that's completely contrary to the way all of the plays had gone before that. So there's always a moment of conquest that the plays lead up to, but Shakespeare turns that upside down. And if there's any conquest at all, it plays out in this kind of claustrophobic domestic sphere between Othello and Desdemona. I think that Shakespeare's taking as I said before, the Islamic focus of the Turk play, and first of all ridiculing it, and then trying to do something new and provocative with it. He's bringing an audience, promising them something, and then offering them something completely different. And in the process, I think he's opening up new kinds of ways of thinking about what we might broadly call otherness on the stage. With a protagonist like Othello, he's drawing on Al-Wazan / Leo Africanus's History of Africa, which again hadn't been used for this sort of material before. It had only just come out in English, of course. He's using that to try and get a level of truthfulness, I suppose, verisimilitude in terms of his depiction of a Moor, but he's also interested in interiority in a way that earlier dramatists simply hadn't been concerned with.
Do you know, with the Othello play, there was an adaptation where Othello didn't actually convert to Christianity, and that he was always like a Muslim, undercover Muslim. What do you think about that? And like a bit like the Moriscos in Spain, like he was still practicing.
It's a really interesting idea, because of course the play itself is not really explicit about Othello's backstory. It gives us hints. He has that famous speech, of course, where he talks about, having lived as a soldier, having escaped various dangerous situations. He taught that, but there's some language there that hints at conversion without ever being explicit about it.
Because the word Moor is used a lot, do you think that has confused people with with the links to Islam because they don't actually know exactly what that word means.
Yes, I think that's certainly the case, and it's led to a whole series of different kinds of approaches to depicting Othello. I mean, through the 80s there was and I suppose on into the 90s there was this big debate that went on about whether Othello, in the terms of the late 16th century, was a blackamoor or a tawny Moor, for instance.
What's the difference
So the
between
tawny Moors were associated with North Africa, and again a lighter skin color, and
right.
blackamoors were often characterized as kind of sub-Saharan African.
Okay.
So tawny Moors were more associated with Islam and that kind of North African littoral, that Mediterranean coast.
Berber,
Yeah.
Moroccan, yeah.
And that's broadly borne out by the Al-Wazan Leo Africanus text, which I'm pretty confident, although again it's not absolutely certain, I'm pretty confident Shakespeare was using when he's writing about Othello. But yes, I think people have generally been confused by the use of that word Moor and what that might mean in terms of religious context, in terms of kind of ethnicity, race. We don't get any sense anywhere in the play exactly where Othello has come from or where he's traveled or who he fought for.
Yeah.
Just that he comes from almost certainly North Africa. He's crossed the Mediterranean to Venice. Venice, of course, itself is a kind of idea that was loaded for Shakespeare's audiences as a city that was more open to Eastern trade and influence than any other in Christendom. Yes. So the fact that he is the Moor of Venice is another interesting kind of apparently oxymoronic statement. How can you be a Moor of Venice? But actually, I think for Shakespeare's contemporaries, it wouldn't have been so unusual to be a Moor of Venice. And I think audiences would have been well aware of that conflict, maybe not its detail, but they would have been well aware that the Venetians had this complex relationship with the Ottomans, and that the Venetians were first and foremost a kind of trading republic. That's what they were known to have been.
So lots of different people coming there, and so it wasn't alien, like to be different.
Yeah. So Venice is quite an interesting kind of portal for thinking from a Christian perspective, certainly from a Northern European Christian perspective, the thinking about interactions between Christians and Muslims, Christians and Africans, Christians and Asians, all sorts of different.
So would you say like our modern perspective on race has sort of influenced the way Othello is depicted now?
On the one hand, yes. I think that our current interests in race, the way in which certain debates about race, particularly in the US, are developing at the moment, inevitably is going to have an impact on the way in which people put Othello on and the way in which people understand it when they see it, and why people keep returning to this text, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when I was growing up and studying Shakespeare at school, I didn't get the Muslim connection at all. I suppose you need to know a bit about the history, which I learned when I was older, about the Moors and all the trading and everything, and the mix within like that term Moor. And I just think like at face value, you can sometimes miss that link, which is quite central to some of Shakespeare's work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with Othello in particular, the way in which it was cut and the way in which it was played, certainly through the civil rights period, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, made it a tragedy of racial conflict. And often the early part of the play and a lot of the references to the Ottoman fleet come in that early part, were cut completely or were downplayed, so that it became a dynamic between Othello and Desdemona. But to do that, I think, shuts off a whole kind of layer of complexity that's very important to understanding what's going on in the play. And if you don't understand that layer of complexity, the Ottoman dimension, the Mediterranean context, the importance of Cyprus, then it doesn't really make sense in the way in which I think it was intended.
And my other question was, why do you think now, I mean, it kind of links to my previous question, but why do you think now that the Western world knows so little about Shakespeare's link with the Muslim world? And because back then you said that there was an awareness, and now it's much less. Like people are quite surprised when you talk about this subject.
Yeah, it's another good question. I think it's about, inevitably, it's about broader geopolitical questions, for me at least. So for Shakespeare's audience, in the wake of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul in the mid 15th century, so 1453, Istanbul falls, the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire collapse. The Ottomans are seen as the great upcoming empire in kind of global history, certainly from a northern European perspective, because England, remember, is very much on the fringes of things at this point. In the late 15th, 16th century, they're conscious of their own peripherality. They're looking at the Mediterranean world and the rise of the Ottomans with a measure of misunderstanding and fear, but also a kind of fascination. And that only increases as the 16th century goes on. The Reformation, of course, takes place, which means that England becomes even more isolated as a kind of Protestant outpost on the edge of a largely Catholic Europe. And that again shifts the way in which they're thinking about the Ottoman Empire. Whereas before they were governed largely by papal dictate, which suggested that no trade, certainly no trade in any kind of materials of war, should take place between Christians and what the papacy characterized as infidels. After the Reformation and the break with Rome, England was free to trade with whomever they liked, and the Ottoman Empire suddenly became a very valuable ally against Catholic aggression. So I get that shifts the kind of geopolitical context. That situation, a kind of English Protestantism that has potential connections and interesting kind of potential synthesis with Islam. The letters between, as you know, the letters between Elizabeth I and the Ottoman Sultan talk about a kind of shared anti-idolatry that might make Protestantism and Islam closer together than a lot of people might have assumed. That carries on into the 17th century. So right the way through the latter part of the 16th century, this is quite a key dynamic. The Ottomans still seem like the growing power, and the English are both kind of interested in engaging with the Ottomans and doing so publicly, whilst also being nervous about the idea of Islam. They're very interested in the Ottomans and Ottoman culture, but Islam, I think, from a kind of rigorous Protestant perspective, continues to seem like a threat. I think it's also true that those people who dealt directly with trade, with diplomacy, with captives, Muslim captives whom the English sailors freed and ended up in London, lots of examples of that. For those people in port cities, it was a different story, and there was much more dynamic interaction going on. So, as I say, that continues into the 17th century. James I, when he comes to the throne in 1603, is slightly less keen on alliances with, again, what he terms infidel nations. He allows trade to continue, but he cuts back on diplomacy. And this coincides through the 17th century with, I suppose, what we might think of as a kind of slowing down of Ottoman advances westward. By the end of the 17th century, the Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, in which the Ottomans had been defeated after their final siege of Vienna, kind of pins the Ottoman Empire back in ways that suggest that they're no longer the threat to Christian Europe that they had been characterized as for previous 200 years plus. And it's a relatively kind of easy line. I mean, it's a slight simplification, but it's an easy line to take from that moment in 1699, where the Ottoman Empire seems kind of tamed to some extent, through to the narrative of the Ottomans as the kind of sick man of Europe that's there in the lead up to the First World War. It's interesting that the kind of rise of Shakespeare, as we understand Shakespeare, kind of traces that line, or that shift in kind of geopolitical power. The prominence of Islam in Shakespeare, or noticing the prominence of Islam in Shakespeare, would have come naturally to people in 1600 in ways that were completely alien to people in 1800, who saw the Ottoman, or 1850, let's say, who saw the Ottoman Empire as a kind of shadow of its former self, and saw these references as kind of antiquated, so they largely ignored them, or they cut them from performance. And I think it's only in the late 20th century and early 21st century that we've started to recover these kinds of contexts.
Would you still say though, like the Islamic world is pretty core to Shakespeare's work?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
I think I think it couldn't have been otherwise, really, given the context that I've been talking about, and given the point at which Shakespeare's career is developing. He couldn't not engage with the Islamic world. There was just no choice. There are no dramatists of this period who are writing plays for the public stage who don't, in some way or another, engage with the Islamic world.
yeah,
And coming back again to where we began, I think that Shakespeare does it in a canny way, because he's seen this great flourishing of this fashion for putting grand Turks on the stage, and he, to some extent, fashions his career out of a reaction against one version of Islam on the stage, and starts to think about how he might use it in different ways. But he
yeah,
has to use it because everybody's using it, and every audiences are expecting some engagement with that, because it is part of the kind of world in which they're living, the dominant
yeah,
narrative that they are that they're hearing from their pulpits, that they're reading from the printing presses.
yeah. And they're interested in it,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
And just finally, I just wanted to ask if you felt that Shakespeare's works could help tackle present day Islamophobia.
Well, I think there are different ways of answering that. Inevitably, I think yes, partly to do with what we're talking about now. If there's a way of bringing audiences back to an understanding of the centrality of Islam to Shakespeare, but also to all of his contemporaries, then I think that gives a much longer narrative than the one I think most people are used to. I think there remains a sort of prevailing assumption that Islam doesn't really feature in the kind of central canon of great English literature, when in fact this is not the case at all. And at particular periods, Islam is right there, right in at the heart of the way in which authors are writing for a public. So I think a recognition of that longer history, that richer, more nuanced, complex history, is key to thinking about how we might break down preconceptions, and Islamophobia is a part of that. Inevitably, we talk about Shakespeare a great deal, because Shakespeare's still the dominant figure. But I've been kind of hinting and mentioning a whole body of drama that exists from 1587, let's say, through to around 1600, let's say, well, even slightly later. 30, 40 plays plus that still exist, that are far more, they approach Islam in a far more interesting and kind of head-on manner than most people would imagine. And most of those plays, partially I think because of their subject matter, have largely been forgotten about. There's some really magnificent plays in there. I mentioned Kidd, Solomon and Poseida, which is a fascinating play, but they're very rarely put on now. And I think it's also very difficult to access them. It would be great to try and make that material more accessible, to start to look at it more carefully, to start to put versions on in theatres, those sorts of things. I mean,
that's really interesting. I didn't know that, because especially when we're talking about getting more diversity into schools, and like with English literature, because we tend to focus on the same things. That would be a massive movement of change, just to diversify the story, and also that the fact that is, the narrative that Islam's alien to the West, but in fact
it's just false. It's just false.
I think it can help break down some of these misconceptions.
It's intriguing that this flourishing of plays interested in Islam on the English stage appear almost exactly as the first English ambassadors are being sent to Istanbul. Very soon after that, the first Turk plays appear. And the relationship between the two is, no one's ever quite pinned it down, but I think it is part of this gathering interest that's triggered by English political engagement directly with the primary Islamic power in the world. And then the second thing is that in 1586, on the 2nd of October, and I know this very specifically, there's a ceremony in East London where a Protestant clergyman called Meredith Hanmer baptizes a Turk. He describes him as a Turk whose name is Chinano. That's the name that's given in the text, although that's certainly a kind of transliteration of Sinan. I suspect it's Sinan.
Yeah.
Who he says has been, Francis Drake has liberated from Spanish captivity. He's been in Spanish captivity for, I think, 25 years in the New World, in South America. Francis Drake raids the coast, liberates all these what are essentially slaves to the Spanish, brings them back to England. There are nearly 100 Turks in his ship. He takes them back to Blackwall in London, and they're offered the choice of whether they want to be shipped back to Istanbul under the terms of the Anglo-Ottoman relationship, or do they want to stay and be baptized and become Protestant and English. Only one of them out of 100 decides to stay, this man, Sinan. And again, the ceremony itself, which seems to have been extremely widely publicized, there's a text that comes out after it, and people reference it all over the place, appears only the year before Tamburlaine comes out, and then all these Turk plays start appearing. So I think there are, again, interesting connections to be made, and it suggests a certain level of familiarity that I think is largely lost in the wider culture. That there are Muslims wandering around London in this period. They've been liberated from Spanish captivity, and a part of England's kind of geopolitical position in the world, or enhancing that position. But we don't see it because this kind of thing is not really mentioned in the context of the development of these plays or Shakespeare's career.
And if I suppose if they had been here that long and then they've intermarried, and so they just look like white English people, and maybe they don't even know their backstory.
Sinan's an interesting one, because a couple of years ago I managed to find his baptism record in the church records, and he's christened William Ferber. Bit of a mystery. But he seems to remain in London. There's a record of a William Ferber marrying a local London woman, a daughter of a cloth merchant, and dying, I think I'm trying to remember, sort of 15 years later. So he can't have been a young man. And also, I suppose 25 years as a captive slave would have taken its toll. But yes, it seems that he married locally and then lived on in London until his death. So just really intriguing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm just conscious of time. This is going to cut off in a minute, but I could speak to you forever. But thank you so much for giving me your time.